Hello, everyone, and welcome back. My name is Kevin, and I'm a freelance artist living in Connecticut. And if you've been following Beyond the Brick across social media, you may have seen some time-lapse videos recently of my artwork. If not, don't worry. We're going to take another look today while I walk you through my creative process of how I brought all these LEGO minifigs to life on paper. Kicking things off is the Dark Knight himself, Batman. You'll notice there at the beginning, I had all my materials laid out as I'm frequently asked what I use to create my artwork. Honestly speaking, most of my work these days is entirely digital. However, I have worked with traditional tools for a majority of my life. A standard number 2 pencil is never too far away, but I opt for a mechanical one when I record videos like this, so I don't have to stop drawing to sharpen. Something you don't see captured in the footage is a tiny concept sketch I draw up before I begin the final artwork on any project. Some artists call this a thumbnail. This is typically a very rough sketch, no bigger than a post-it note, but that helps me visualize how I want my subject to appear and acts as a reference tool throughout the entire process. It's actually hiding just to my left out of frame here. Once I've drawn my entire subject in pencil, I'll take a kneaded eraser and lightly brush across the lines I've just laid out. This is to remove any excess lead in order to prolong the life of my markers, as they're alcohol-based and thus prone to bleeding into the felt tip. Of course, I still need to see what I'm coloring, so I have to be careful not to remove too much. Once the colors are on, it's time for the final step, which is the inked line work. I prefer Micron brand pens, which can be found easily across art supply channels in a variety of weights and tips. You'll notice I ink after coloring for the same reason I remove excess lead from the pencil work, to limit bleed into my markers and prolong their life. Speaking of which, what type of markers do I use? I use Copic brand markers. They're fairly common amongst professional artists across the industry, but tend to be more costly. Although you can purchase packs of the markers just like a box of crayons, it's more common to purchase each Copic marker individually based on your needs or projects, but they produce hundreds of them in any color you can imagine. Looks like it's time to watch the Man of Steel take flight. Next up, Superman. For this particular project, I opted to illustrate the most iconic, classic outfits of both Superman and Batman from earlier. Keeping a wide audience in mind, I felt it had the highest chance of pleasing the masses. The pose was intended to convey Superman floating as he looks down on the citizens of Metropolis. I always picture Superman with a smile on his face. Unless, of course, he's fighting for the survival of the universe, but there's no such crisis here. Have you noticed how often the paper will spin while I work on the piece? Artists tend to rotate their canvas throughout the creative process numerous times. It's all about finding that comfort level of laying out your line work. Believe it or not, in order to give you guys the best view possible, I actually limited my spinning of the paper much more than I normally do. This just kept it nicely centered on the screen for you. I hope it doesn't make you too dizzy. In addition to inking the artwork with pens, I favor a nice, bold outline in my artwork. So I polish off my subjects with a wide outline achieved with a simple Sharpie. Yes, I'm sure there are much fancier options out there, but it gets the job done and is relatively inexpensive. I gotta save my money for all those markers anyway. And a bit of advice to all my fellow artists. Don't forget to sign your work. Be proud of what you've created. Whether my artwork is traditional or digital, I always add my initials and the year to my finished works of art. I particularly find the year helpful as I look back over older pieces and see where my skills have improved or evolved. From the skies of Metropolis to a galaxy far, far away, next up is Rey and BB8 from Star Wars. And it looks like I may have misplaced my mechanical pencil on this one, but that's the real deal there, folks. That's my trusty number 2 pencil. This was actually the only piece from the entire project that featured 2 separate characters in one illustration. I wanted to spotlight a character from the Star Wars sequel trilogy for younger fans, and Rey was an easy choice. Personally, I'm a big fan of her scavenger storyline, so I chose to hop back to 2015 and illustrate her outfit as seen in The Force Awakens when she first met BB-8. Remember those pricey markers I mentioned? Well, I don't have a vast collection. In fact, I don't even own more than 30 of them. So sometimes I just don't have the right match. When it came to coloring in Rey, I didn't have a tan that would match the main part of her outfit, so I decided to use a redwood brown I had. Admittedly, it's much darker than anticipated, but that's just how it goes sometimes. Did you notice the light blue I used when adding shadow to BB-8? Unless it's absolutely necessary, I prefer shading in white objects with hues of blue. I find that using blue feels more organic and not as cold or sterile as using gray tones for shading. Saying that aloud, it seems ironic as I'm literally coloring in a robot. As I was inking, I actually noticed I had neglected to add in a darker brown for shading on the sides of Rey's legs and body. So you'll notice I take a quick break from the ink work to hop back to colors before returning to finish things up. Now, we can't have the light without the dark. And of course, we cannot forget the original baddie from Star Wars, Darth Vader. What's particularly interesting while watching me sketch out Vader is the number of times I erased and redrew his arms. Did you catch that? Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Don't be afraid to erase. If something doesn't feel right, give it another shot. And that's just what I did here. Sometimes when I'm frustrated with a particular detail of a sketch, I'll move on to another area of the subject just to give myself a creative break from the trouble. That's why you'll see the overall figure continue to flesh out, even though the arms keep coming and going. Once I finally got that pencil work ironed out, it was time once again for colors. And figures that are all black are always a bit trickier when it comes to coloring. You can't just slap black all over everything, otherwise you lose all the details and depth of your artwork. So you need to be quite strategic in where you choose to apply black. Ideally, it's going to be used in your darkest areas of the piece. So once we identify what that is, in this case, the lightsaber hilt, cape, and eyes in his helmet, I work up from there using different shades of gray. So Darth Vader is actually more gray here than black, something you may have noticed earlier with Batman as well. Speaking of his eyes, I really wanted to somehow convey that muted red lens that you see in certain shots of Darth Vader throughout the films, but I feared it would simply look like Vader has bright red eyes, which was not my desired outcome, so I stuck with the black here. Now, we can't just go drawing characters from all of our favorite licensed properties, can we? What about some homegrown classic LEGO themes? Enter the iconic knight sporting a black falcon's crest, I might add. Right off the bat, you'll notice my knight was initially equipped with an axe. And I wasn't displeased with the sketch work on that axe or the arm placement, but sadly, I felt it bumped up to the top of the paper too much, and I feared it would cramp the overall artwork in an odd way. So a quick reapproach swapped out the axe for a sword held firmly in front of his body, quite similarly to what we just saw with Darth Vader. I used the magic of illustration to change up the shield for the sake of the artwork. Any eagle-eyed LEGO fans will be quick to educate you on the non-existence of such a shield element, but I wanted it to fall slightly behind the figure, as seen in historical research of real knights. And that's another treat of being comfortable with your artwork and exploring. Just because it may not be a real LEGO part, doesn't mean you can't draw it. Something I find very interesting is that I tend to begin approaching character design and the human form from the head first. Even more specifically, the eyes, nose, and mouth. The head shape will form out from there, and then I'll move on to the body. When drawing minifigs, I almost always start from the torso. I'm not quite sure why that is, but you'll notice the first strokes of my pencil always seem to establish that bowed-out rectangular form of the torso before anything else. One of my favorite characters from DC Comics has always been the Amazonian princess Wonder Woman. For this illustration, I wanted to follow the trend set by her fellow superheroes Batman and Superman by showcasing her in a classic outfit not tied to any particular source material. And I actually sketched out two separate concepts, one featuring her with a sword and the other with the classic lasso of truth. Obviously the lasso won out, which is good, as if I had pushed forward with the sword, I fear it would be too similar to the knight we just looked at, which was already similar to Darth Vader's lightsaber. However, something Wonder Woman does have in common with the knight is she also gets to wield a fictional LEGO element. Although I appreciate the molded lasso element supplied by the LEGO group, I wasn't interested in drawing her while the lasso was mid-throw. Earlier we talked about mistakes, and two of my mistakes actually carried through to the final artwork on this piece. Can you spot them? I accidentally colored her arm bracelets gold instead of silver. Although I caught my error before finishing the colors, there wasn't really an effective way of correcting it, so I just went with it. Embarrassingly, I also totally neglected to draw the white stars on her skirt. I know. You know what's the worst? I didn't even catch my mistake when I drew it, only when I posted it online later. The worst. It just goes to show you, everyone makes mistakes, and those mistakes shouldn't keep you from sharing your work. Now, we're halfway through the drawings, and if I haven't lost you yet, I just want to take a moment to thank you for being interested in this video, my commentary, and my artwork in general. If you'd like to see more of my work, you can head over to my website, which is kevinahinkle.com, or you can find me on social media at Mr. Hinkle Draws. So I think it's about time we see some superheroes from the Marvel arena. And just as he launched the Marvel Cinematic Universe, we see Iron Man blast off first. I knew from the concept stage that I wanted to illustrate Iron Man flying. There's something so iconic about those jet streaks emitting from his feet and hands. And although it depends on the source material being referenced, I thought a nice blue flame would contrast the red and yellow of his armor well. I specifically wanted to reference a suit of armor seen in one of the Marvel films as opposed to the classic look and approach I took with the DC superheroes. I feel as though Marvel films have ingrained themselves so successfully in pop culture that those looks are the classics now, but we'll stick to the artwork and leave the debate on superheroes and iconography for another video. One of my challenges in drawing this pose was getting the legs right. The character flies by keeping his feet close together to allow the jets from both legs to connect quite closely. Minifigure feet are clunky and don't touch each other without breaking or disconnecting them from the hip. So I knew this drawing would require some good old-fashioned rubber limbs. You can spot some examples of such an approach with official artwork from LEGO themselves. Consider how a minifigure crosses its arms or rotates its body on the hips. Swinging in next is our friendly neighborhood SpiderMan. The character demands a very dynamic pose, so I knew he had to be web swinging. His right arm, unfortunately, runs right up to the edge of the paper, and that's something I try to avoid at all costs, unless it's a background element of some kind, but certainly not with the main subject matter. If you recall, this very fear pushed my change in direction while sketching out the knight earlier. But I was really happy with the flow of the rest of the figure and couldn't immediately see a way to alter the arm while preserving the rest of the work, so I winced and kept on drawing. This was one of those subjects that I really needed a reference image on call. I have an idea in my head of how Spider-Man's suit is laid out, but even then I dare not color something that's meant to be red-blue or vice versa. So while this was coming together, I had my concept sketch to my left, and right next to that was my mobile phone with a high resolution of LEGO Spider-Man pulled up. Obviously, Spider-Man's webbing is white, but when you're drawing on a white piece of paper, that's not really a color option unless of course you leave the paper exposed, which is great for highlights, not so good for anything else. So I opted to finish out the piece with some quick ink work to add in his webs in black. The squiggly lines that are emanating from our hero's head symbolize the classic Spidey sense and mimics how comic book illustrators have portrayed the power throughout his existence. Did I just turn the paper sideways? I did, and for good reason. I try my best to use the canvas to its fullest potential. And in this case, we needed some room for our next character, Benny, the classic LEGO blue spaceman from the LEGO movie. Benny actually gets away as the only artwork from this collection that got illustrated in a horizontal positioning, although I regret not turning my paper for Spider-Man. I think he could have done well with a horizontal canvas too. Something you'll notice more predominantly here is the rubber limbs I mentioned earlier. It's almost like macaroni noodle arms, but it works and adds a bit of silliness to the drawing too. I mean, it's a toy, right? Or perhaps it's just a highly sophisticated interlocking brick system. I always have a lot of fun drawing Benny, and his popularity is truly amazing, as when I take requests online or at a trade show, he never fails to pop up time and time again, so I rarely require any reference for him. Benny also got a nice blue aura added around him after I finished up the ink work, I don't know, I felt like it needed it. I was actually very close to adding in some stars around him as well, but held off to better match the other illustrations. So, Black Widow, our third character from the Marvel Universe, was actually the most challenging piece for me to work on throughout the entire project. There's a ton of little details in her outfit, such as the iconic red hourglass on her belt buckle to the bright blue striping down her sides, which indicate an electrical charge. This forced me to really slow down on my coloring, as a mistake could be difficult or impossible to correct. You can always throw a darker color on top of a lighter color, albeit you may end up with an entirely different color than you had hoped for, but once a dark color is on the paper, there really is no effective way to lay a lighter one on top of it. So the red of the belt buckle, light gray of the zippers, and bright blue on the striping would have no chance of peeking through if I accidentally colored in the wrong spot. I mentioned earlier that I have a limited collection of Copic markers, and sometimes I just have to use what I have versus what I'd like to have. Another great example of this is coloring Black Widow's hair. I would have hoped for a nicer red-orange mix, but I really don't have such a color, so I had to choose bright orange or bright red. I went with the orange, and that left me with a secondary problem, adding shadow. Since I don't have a darker orange, I used that redwood color we saw from Rey earlier. The results aren't terrible, but it's more dramatic change in color than I would normally apply. Anyone who's played with LEGO bricks before knows there's no shortage of emergency service personnel in LEGO City. And I would be remiss if I didn't include one of these main actors in the collection of illustrations. During my brainstorming, I had originally planned on drawing a police officer. I mean, you don't get more iconic to LEGO than that. But the ongoing news of today persuaded me to make a quick adjustment and draw a nurse. That being said, the nurse was only the second character I drew with no reference. Something I forgot to color in before inking was the LEGO Group's iconic half-moon inserts on the sides of the minifigure to indicate the character is female. Now, I certainly don't think such design aesthetics are 100% required to indicate gender by any means. However, when drawing LEGO minifigs for a wider audience, it's best to reference how the company goes about designing what you're referencing. This helps keep things familiar and easily recognizable. So I quickly filled that in with the darker blue before switching back and finishing out the inked line work. Before we move on to our last drawing, let me take a moment to offer my sincere thanks to all the medical professionals across the world who've been working endless hours and putting their own lives at risk as we all endure this global pandemic in 2020. Please know that we appreciate your time, energy, and dedication to guiding us through this time. Our last illustration is actually the very first one I did, and in many ways the proof of concept piece for exploring this entire series from Beyond the Brick. I figured, what better subject than Beyond the Brick itself? So I took to drawing a classic smiling minifig sporting the uniform seen in the official minifigures you can purchase from the channel. Although I did take the liberty of tweaking the logo placement to more accurately match what you'd see on site at a physical LEGO fan event. This first character did well to fill the space of the canvas, and I actually think it may be the largest drawing from the entire run. Something else that makes it stand out is the shadow I added to the bottom of the figure. This is something I do often, and is oddly missing from many of the prior illustrations here. Just adding a shadow gives the overall drawing more depth. It's a tangible object no longer floating in the white void, although that's exactly what Benny was doing from a moment ago. This entire piece, along with a vast majority of other subjects, took about 25 minutes each. I wasn't trying to rush things, but that was a fairly comfortable pace, keeping in mind I would have all my materials on hand, along with reference pulled up, and a completed concept sketch. And of course, we cannot forget the added pressure to film the process from beginning to end. As we watch this last piece come together, I want to once again address any aspiring artist out there. Minifigs are weird. They have odd proportions and a limited range of motion. Don't get hung up on trying to get everything right. Practice, draw from reference, and check out how your fellow artists approach problems, and don't be afraid to make mistakes. And that's a wrap, everyone. I want to thank Beyond the Brick for inviting me to share my thoughts and commentary with you all in this video. And I want to thank you for taking an interest in my artwork and creative process enough to listen. Don't forget to join me for more artwork across social media at Mr. Hinkle Draws and online at kevinahinkle.com. If you'd like to see more of my artwork come to life before your eyes in real time, consider joining me during my live streams every Friday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern on both YouTube and Twitch. I'd love to have you stop by. Wishing you all a wonderful rest of your day. And cut.